A rat with its vagus nerve severed will eat. It will chew, swallow, digest, absorb nutrients, and survive. But it will never develop a conditioned preference for food based on how that food made it feel. Cut the line between the gut and the brain, and the animal loses something that looks, from the outside, almost like wisdom, the accumulated record of what worked and what didn't, written not in memory, but in the body's own signaling architecture. The gut was sending that information up, the brain was filing it. Sever the wire and the filing stops. I find this genuinely disturbing, and I want to sit with it for a moment before I explain why it's relevant to what you do in the first 10 minutes after you wake up. Because what it tells us is that the stomach is not a passive receptacle. It is an active biological intelligence, running sensory, secretory, neural, and immunological operations continuously. And the state it is in when it receives its first morning input determines the fidelity of every one of those operations for the hours that follow. The question of what your stomach should get first every morning is not a nutritional question. It is a question about the physical readiness of a machine that has been running in a maintenance-only mode for 6 to 8 hours, and what that machine requires before it can be asked to do real work again. Now look, let's be precise about what the stomach actually is when you wake up, because the picture is considerably stranger than the popular version suggests. During sleep, the splanchnic circulation, the arterial network supplying the gut, reduces perfusion by somewhere between 20 and 40% during deeper sleep phases. This is deliberate thermodynamic budget management. The body is expensive to run. The gut is among the most expensive organs per unit mass because it is performing continuous active transport operations, maintaining a mucosal barrier against what is essentially a corrosive environment, dividing its epithelial cells at one of the fastest rates in the body, and running a neural network of 500 million neurons that rivals the spinal cord in complexity. Overnight, when digestive demand drops to zero, the body pulls resources away from these operations and redirects them toward glymphatic brain clearance, cellular repair, and immune consolidation. The gut goes into something like a reduced load standby mode. The consequence of 6 to 8 hours in that mode is specific and physical. Let me sketch this on the board. Here is the mucosal surface of the stomach, this densely folded epithelium covered in specialized cells, with a mucus layer sitting above it and hydrochloric acid sitting above that. The protection of the living cells from that acid is not structural, it is energetic. The bicarbonate secreted into the base of the mucus layer by the mucosal cells creates a pH gradient, acid on the luminal side, near neutral at the cell surface. That gradient is the margin of survival for the epithelial cells, and that gradient is maintained continuously by active bicarbonate secretion, which requires ATP, which requires a functioning proton motive force across the inner mitochondrial membrane of every mucosal cell doing the secreting. After 8 hours of reduced splanchnic perfusion, reduced oxygen delivery, and fasted substrate availability, the mitochondrial membrane potential in these cells has drifted. The electrochemical gradient that drives ATP synthase, the molecular turbine that phosphorylates ADP to ATP at roughly 150 revolutions per second in a well-fueled cell, has partially dissipated. The turbine slows. Bicarbonate secretion drops in rate. The pH gradient that protects the mucosal surface compresses. The margin between the acid and the living cells is narrower at 6 in the morning than it was at 11 the night before. Not collapsed, not failed, but measurably thinner. This is the tissue that receives whatever you choose to give it first. And the entire popular conversation about morning nutrition, the intermittent fasting debates, the protein first arguments, the coffee versus juice versus nothing discourse, is conducted in complete indifference to this physical fact about the tissue doing the receiving. The argument for water is not a soft wellness argument. It is a molecular mechanics argument, and it starts with blood viscosity. Overnight, insensible water losses, respiration, transepidermal evaporation, the continuous turnover of the mucosal epithelium itself amount to 4 to 700 milliliters, enough to raise plasma osmolality measurably. And plasma osmolality governs blood viscosity through a mechanism that carries direct physical consequences for the gut. More solutes per unit water in the plasma means the blood is more viscous. The Hagen-Poiseuille equation, which describes viscous flow through cylindrical vessels, is unambiguous. Volumetric flow rate is inversely proportional to viscosity at a given driving pressure. The heart does not increase its output to compensate for morning dehydration. So perfusion drops in the peripheral microvascular beds, and the splanchnic circulation is not the priority when blood viscosity rises. The brain and heart get their supply. The gut absorbs the cut. Reduced splanchnic perfusion means reduced oxygen delivery to the mucosal cells. Reduced oxygen delivery means the electron transport chain, the protein complexes in the inner mitochondrial membrane that pump protons to build the gradient ATP synthase harvests, runs at lower output. The proton motive force drops further. ATP synthase slows further. Bicarbonate secretion drops further. The mucosal margin compresses more. And every cell that is dividing during this window, and cells in the gastric mucosa are dividing every 3 to 5 days, which is one of the fastest turnover rates in the body, is doing so with less ATP available to the proofreading machinery that checks its DNA replication for errors. This is where the argument shifts from plumbing to information theory, and it is where the casual morning routine conversation completely loses the thread. DNA replication fidelity is not a fixed property of the cell. It is an energetically dependent property. The proofreading exonuclease activity of DNA polymerase delta, the molecular mechanism that catches and corrects mismatched bases during replication, requires ATP. The mismatch repair proteins that scan behind the polymerase and fix errors that slip through also require ATP. The oxidative environment in the nucleus matters too. Reactive oxygen species, when not adequately quenched by glutathione and superoxide dismutase, modify DNA bases and create lesions that the repair machinery has to correct before division completes. The efficiency of all of this, the entire molecular quality control apparatus that ensures each daughter cell receives a faithful copy of the genome, scales with energy availability and oxidative status. The gastric mucosa divides every 3 to 5 days, 70 to 120 cell generations per year. In each generation, a cell with slightly less ATP available to its proofreading machinery, in a slightly more oxidatively stressed nuclear environment, copies 3.2 billion base pairs with slightly higher error probability than a cell operating at full energetic capacity. The individual error is vanishingly small, but the cumulative product of many cell generations, each accumulating errors at a slightly elevated rate, is a mutation load that compounds over years and decades in the tissue most exposed to chemical injury in the human body. The stomach is not an arbitrary site for one of the most aggressive epithelial cancers known. The molecular mechanics predict it. Now look, none of this is solved by a glass of water in the sense that water prevents cancer. The argument is not that dramatic, and I won't make it that way. The argument is that the morning biophysical state of the gastric mucosa is not a trivial variable, that it is governed by specific and well understood physical laws, and that the cheapest, fastest, most mechanistically direct intervention for restoring that tissue to its optimal operating state before it is asked to process food is the ingestion of plain water in a physiologically adequate volume. 3 to 500 milliliters of room temperature water absorbed rapidly from the small intestine begins normalizing plasma osmolality within minutes. Blood viscosity drops. Splanchnic microvascular perfusion improves. Oxygen delivery to the mucosal cells rises. The mitochondrial membrane potential begins recovering. ATP synthase spins faster. Bicarbonate secretion rate increases. The mucosal pH gradient widens. The margin between the acid and the living cells reconstitutes toward its baseline width. The cells dividing in the next 20 minutes do so with better ATP availability and in a less oxidatively stressed environment than they would have had water not been ingested first. The entire cascade, from ingestion to meaningful mucosal recovery, takes roughly 20 to 30 minutes. This is the startup sequence. And like any complex machine's startup sequence, it should not be skipped. The enteric nervous system deserves separate attention here because it is almost never included in these discussions, and it should be, because what happens to gut motility and secretory coordination in the morning is directly determined by the ionic state of 500 million neurons that most people don't know they have. The resting membrane potential of a neuron, the electrical baseline that must be maintained before coordinated firing is possible, is governed by the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. This pump continuously exports sodium and imports potassium across the neuronal membrane, maintaining the ionic gradient that is the battery powering neural signaling. It requires ATP. Overnight dehydration and fluid redistribution perturb the extracellular ionic environment around the enteric neurons. The resting membrane potential of those neurons drifts slightly. The coordinated firing patterns that run peristalsis, synchronize secretory timing, and regulate pyloric opening and closing, all of these are phase-sensitive operations that depend on neurons firing at the right times relative to each other. When the ionic baseline drifts, the timing precision degrades. The practical consequence is this. If food or a complex beverage arrives at the stomach before water has restored the extracellular ionic environment of the enteric network, the pyloric reflex, the mechanism controlling how fast gastric contents empty into the duodenum, is running with slightly degraded coordination. The timing between gastric emptying and pancreatic enzyme secretion, which must be synchronized for proper fat and protein digestion, is off. Cholecystokinin released from duodenal eye cells in response to fat triggers gallbladder contraction and pancreatic secretion, but if the gastric emptying rate is dysregulated, the bile and lipase arrive in the duodenum out of phase with the fat bolus they're supposed to emulsify. Enzymatic efficiency drops. You absorb a measurably smaller fraction of what you ate. Let me put some specificity around what water ingestion does to the enteric system. The mechanical distension of the stomach wall by 300 to 500 milliliters of water activates stretch receptors that feed into the vagal reflex arc, amplifying the migrating motor complex, the coordinated wave of smooth muscle contraction that has been sweeping the GI tract every 90 minutes during sleep in an attempt to clear residual material from the lumen. The stomach sweeps itself. Overnight, residual gastric acid, desquamated epithelial cells, and metabolic byproducts are mobilized toward the duodenum and cleared. The chemoreceptors on the freshly exposed mucosal surface, the receptors that will detect amino acids, glucose, and fatty acids from the first food and trigger the hormonal cascade that coordinates digestion, are now operating on a clean substrate rather than a layer of overnight residual fluid. Their signaling is more precise. The hormonal responses they trigger are better calibrated to the actual composition of the incoming meal. The cortisol awakening response is the final piece of this picture, and it is worth being precise about because it is frequently mischaracterized. Cortisol peaks within 30 to 45 minutes of waking, driven by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the hypothalamic master clock. At this morning concentration and timing, cortisol is not a stress hormone in the pathological sense. It is a thermodynamic primer. mobilizing hepatic glycogen, driving gluconeogenesis, preparing the organism's circulating energy substrate for the demands of the active phase. It also modulates gastric acid secretion and has effects on mucosal barrier integrity. In a properly hydrated system with a reconstituted mucosal pH gradient, these effects are within the design operating range of the tissue. In a still dehydrated, still compressed system, the cortisol-driven acid secretory effects arrive at a mucosal surface already running with a thinner than optimal bicarbonate defense. The oxidative environment at the epithelial surface worsens briefly. The margin compresses further. The cells dividing during the cortisol peak do so in a more hostile molecular environment than they needed to. 20 minutes of water ingestion before the cortisol peak or concurrently with it changes this outcome materially. There is a temptation when you lay out an argument this mechanistically to reach for a more complicated conclusion, to recommend electrolytes, mineral salts, lemon juice, specific water temperatures, elaborate morning protocols. Some of these have real secondary justifications. Room temperature water is better than ice cold because cold water induces gastric vasoconstriction via thermal reflex, briefly reducing the mucosal perfusion improvement that warm water facilitates. A small amount of dissolved mineral content, the trace electrolytes in natural spring water, or a conservative pinch of mineral salt, marginally accelerates the ionic rebalancing of the enteric extracellular environment. Lemon juice carries potassium and small amounts of citrate, which enters cellular metabolism as a TCA cycle substrate and can modestly support mitochondrial output. These are real effects, but they are secondary. The primary intervention, the one that does the thermodynamic heavy lifting, is the volume of water itself, the osmolality correction, the viscosity reduction, the splanchnic reperfusion, the mitochondrial recovery. These are first-order effects, and they require nothing more than an adequate volume of water delivered before anything else. The point is actually quite subtle, and it's this. The value of water first thing in the morning is not that water is nutritionally superior to coffee or food. Water has no calories, no bioactive compounds, no hormonal effects. Its value is that it restores the physical operating conditions of a tissue that cannot process anything else properly until those conditions are restored. It is not a nutritional input. It is a systems reset. And a system that has not been reset cannot perform at full output, regardless of how well optimized the inputs that follow it are. This is why the popular conversation about morning nutrition is structurally confused. It debates the quality of the inputs without asking whether the machine receiving those inputs is in a state to process them. A perfectly formulated meal consumed by a gut operating with depleted mitochondrial ATP, degraded enteric neural coordination, a compressed mucosal pH margin, and elevated plasma viscosity absorbs less efficiently, triggers hormonal cascades with lower precision, and imposes a higher oxidative cost on the mucosal epithelium than a simpler meal consumed after the system has been physically reset. The macronutrient composition is a secondary variable. The biophysical readiness of the tissue is the primary one. And the biophysical readiness of the tissue requires one thing, costs nothing, takes 20 minutes, and has been available for the entirety of human existence. This is the thing about working with physical law rather than against it. The laws of thermodynamics applied to the gastric mucosal system do not produce complicated answers. They produce simple ones. They say, the tissue was running at reduced energy output for 8 hours. Its first requirement is the substrate that directly addresses that energy deficit fastest and most mechanistically. That substrate is not macronutrient. It is not stimulant. It is water, the solvent in which every biological reaction in the mucosal cell occurs, the determinant of plasma viscosity, the corrector of extracellular ionic imbalance, the mechanical trigger for the gut's own self-clearing motor pattern. The human body spent 4 billion years refining this machine. The gastric mucosa is extraordinarily robust. It handles conditions that would destroy almost any other tissue, does so daily, and regenerates itself completely every few days. It is not fragile, but it is physical. It runs on physical laws. And physical laws, unlike health trends, are not negotiable, do not respond to market pressure, and do not vary between individuals. Every gastric mucosa and every human wakes up in a compressed, mildly hypoperfused, ionically perturbed state. Every one of them begins its recovery the moment water arrives. Every one of them stays in that compressed state, paying its elevated thermodynamic tax with each dividing cell, each slightly imprecise pyloric reflex, each slightly noisier hormonal signal until the water arrives. The tax is quiet, the body compensates for it so effectively that you cannot feel it happening. You wake up, skip the water, drink the coffee, eat the food, and feel fine. And you are fine in the sense that the system is resilient enough to manage. But management is not optimization. Compensation is not the same as correct operation. And a biological machine that is managed and compensated for decades accumulates in its tissues the molecular record of every day it was asked to operate before its physical requirements were met. That record is written in the replicative fidelity of the fastest dividing epithelium in your body, in the baseline inflammatory tone of the most chemically stressed mucosal surface you have, in the long-run signal precision of a gut-brain communication system that is trying to file an accurate report about the body's metabolic state every single day. The machine keeps the record faithfully. It just does it quietly, one cell division at a time, one morning at a time, for the length of a human life. Water first, adequate volume, before anything else, not because it is profound, but because it is what the physics requires. And in biological systems, the physics always, eventually, wins.